Hong Kong has been all over the news lately, with massive coverage on its tension with China. Previously, the Umbrella Movement in 2014, and now the Million People protest that had been ongoing recently. But this video isn't going into that, but rather take a look at something else that has taken a big role in forming the Hong Kong that we know of today. In current times, Hong Kong is known as the concrete jungle, that is, the metropolitan center for a variety of financial and business services. This is largely due to two factors: its historic strategic location as the import dock between exchanges of goods between the East and the West, and secondly, the citizens' unique identity in that they were raised by the British when it was part of its grand colony. These two key factors has made Hong Kong the bridge between the East and the West for the past decades, before globalization really took place through the booming of technology. A lot of Hong Kongers are conversational in three key languages of Cantonese, English, and Mandarin. This was extremely important in its growth to becoming a global economical force, despite its small size. Since China had been on a rapid growth, and with the West having increasingly more business ties with the rising dragon, that is China, Hong Kong was the essential middleman. Needless to say, the British played somewhat of an important role in the development of Hong Kong as it raised Hong Kong as its child. To give the British credit where credit is due, they were certainly the catalyst in building Hong Kong's economy. As a result, people here feel extremely proud of their British heritage. They tend to completely overlook the fact that Hong Kong was a colony. In fact, I can go as far as to say that there is actually a positive connotation to the word colonization. Like, we were proud to be under someone else's rule. Isn't that ironic? I actually had to learn the concept of how colonization was truly problematic in the US, where racial dynamics were much more pronounced. But with Hong Kong, there was no major traumatic event that really allowed people to shape hatred for the colonizer. Hence, it is kind of just an accepted fact, like, oh, Hong Kong was part of British colony, and people move on with their lives. In many ways, you can even say that it was a glorified part of our history. For instance, all the ceremonies were heavily documented and celebrated. Here are various comments of people reacting to the topic of handover. And it's not just ceremonies either. Here's a clip of a typical response when people are asked how they feel about the colonial era.
I have a lot of nostalgia about the time that Hong Kong was the colony of the UK. I always feel that was a really golden era, like the movie industry.
Extremely sensational. This is why perspective matters. Our history books have more or less been written under the British jurisdiction and have thus only painted them in a positive light. Since the turnover in 1997, we could have had a chance to look at it more holistically. But before anything critical could be said about our problematic history, China had taken the spotlight in becoming the media antagonist, and no one has since bothered to start the conversation of our past. It was partially the fact that the oppression by the British was done subtly. I was not living during the colonial era, so I had done a bit of research through relatives and friends. What I learned is that on the surface and in everyday interactions, the British were on very good terms with the locals. For example, I have asked my grandma on her memories with interacting with the British. She was a blue-collar worker, and her managerial staff were always someone of British descent. To my surprise, most of her memories were pleasant, and I could imagine this being the case for many other people and families. Looking at it through a micro level could never justify our supposed grudge against them. The situation has to be looked at from a macro scale to see what kind of systemic oppression really took place. The analogy that I like to use is that Hong Kongers were the housekeepers to the well managed house owners that were the British. Unlike what happened in America, the colonization that took place in Hong Kong was very well sugarcoated. On the surface, people were treated like normal citizens and all was well. But if you dig deep enough, you'll find dirt that has occurred throughout history, such as 1967 riots that resulted in a large number of casualties, or the fact that the British were educated by a completely different system from local citizens back then to justify why they would later in life be handed positions of power. What happens with systemic oppression like this is that it created a generation of ordinary local citizens that saw Caucasians and British as the elite race. To this day, my grandfather still sees himself as a servant to the British because of the years of conditioning. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Colonization is so much more than that. The biggest issue, in my opinion, are the ways in which culture has affected our way of life. Being fluent in English in Hong Kong, and to some extent globally, is seen as superior to being fluent in Chinese. But people don't tend to think about it much because it is so ingrained in our education and upbringing. And I hate to say that this is a blame game, but I think that it's time for people to divert some of their attention to the effects that the British has created in the Hong Kong society. This is also not to send hate towards British people, because most people alive now have had nothing direct to do with this piece of history. But rather, this is an attempt for people to look at how society has shaped because of history and realize their own biases shaped by our culture.